Hi everybody, this is Duke, back with another video. This semester starting up again, fall 2024, and I am here to help with some of your soldering content this semester. So I have here a bunch of stuff on the desk, and I'm going to be talking about some of this equipment and items I have here, and then going through some of the soldering assignments with you as you work on those this semester. So I have kind of a smorgasbord of things here. This was kind of just a nice way to intro the video. We'll talk about some of this stuff and we'll get into it in this video. I think I'll break this up into maybe 3 videos, a little bit of intro here, and then we'll do, there's 2 assignments this semester, so we'll work on those in the other videos. So let me clear this real quick and we'll talk about soldering a little bit more and what it is used for. I actually had a cool demo board that I just made, and so I wanted to show it off, of course, a little bit. What is soldering used for? Okay. Here is a demonstration board I made from some other classes. And you can see it's got wires and stuff going everywhere. I'm not going to get too deep into what it's for right now, but this is an ArduPilot flight controller demonstration board. I'm pretty proud of it. Maybe it doesn't look like too much, but I wanted to show you guys this because it's a great example of what soldering can be used for in the world of UAS or drones. Here we have a flight controller. You can see all these little silver dots there. Those are all solder joints. We have some soldering over here for our motor, our ESC, battery leads to plug our battery into. Each of these little items has some solder on it. This is a receiver. We zoom out a little bit here. We have our LED power source over here, LEDs along the sides. It's all over. Soldering's all over. Solder here to splice this rangefinder into this connection. So you really see it everywhere, and you can't really do a lot of things without being able to solder, at least in the drone world, unless maybe you stay in the kind of developmental world where you're using more of the PixHawks with all the plug-in connectors. But I still think soldering is a very valuable skill because you'll definitely need it at some point or another in the world of drones. So, soldering supplies. Let's start with this one actually. Some of you may have seen something like this, maybe on your grandpa's tool bench or in the science lab or something like that at school or whatever. Lots of places you can see these. But this is a soldering iron. This is kind of a typical standard one that you might see out in the world, I guess you might say. It's a bench model, so it has a wall plug. The iron's here. It's got removable tips. This one has removable tips. It's got a on-off switch here, and then you have a little dial here to control the temperature. Unfortunately, this temperature is not actually in degrees. It's just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, kind of like a toaster or something. So 5 is hotter, 1 is cooler, right? But generally speaking, on these ones, at least on these Wellers here, when we're soldering class, we're between a 3 and a 4 in terms of temperature. Seems to work pretty well. Should be around close to 400 degrees Celsius. 350 to 400 degrees Celsius is where we want to solder most of the stuff that's about the size we're going to use. We also have a sponge here. This is just a sponge you would get wet in the sink and wring it out. That's used for cleaning the iron tip. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But here we have a kind of typical standard iron, a welder. You can buy these online. You can buy these sometimes at Home Depot or Lowe's or things like that. It's about the only kind of iron you can find in retail stores in my experience. The other irons I'll show you have to buy online just because they're not common enough to be sold in stores, typically anyways. Okay, so there's our standard iron. You may have one of these from your drone classes. You may have a different type. It depends on what classes you're taking and where you're taking them and that kind of thing. But these irons work great. They do have interchangeable tips like I mentioned, so I'll look at some more tips later. Basically, there's a small screw here. You pull this tip out and you put a different tip in. And we look at the other tips. I'll show you why that's important. So that's one kind of iron there. Kind of a desktop iron. This is a iron. This is my personal iron that I've bought a few years back. I like it. It is a Sequire. I don't know what the brand or the model is. It's not even on here. Inexpensive model, kind of a knockoff of a TS100 if you've ever heard of those. This one does have interchangeable tips, so I've tightened this down, so I'm not going to pull this tip out right now. A little OLED display here. And this one actually can get power from a barrel adapter. It's not focusing there. Barrel adapter, okay, or a micro USB. So I just use a barrel adapter power source to power this. Micro USB, you can update the firmware and stuff I think on these, or you can power it via that, but the barrel adapter works better. A DC 5525 barrel and I use about 20 volts to power this, and that works really well. Heats up really fast, gets to what I need it to be. This is a computer controlled temperature, so I can dial in the temperature here on the screen by using these buttons and change other settings and things as well. So I like this iron. I've been using it a lot recently. It works really well, but it's one option that's out there. A few years old now. I don't know if they still sell this one, but they have similar ones that are available. Some of you also might have one of these irons, which is one that comes in our newbie drone toolkit. If you have taken a class where you get that kit, this is the iron you got. Okay. This one has temperature control as well, actual temperature, but it is a kind of analog here. I don't know if you're going to be able to see it very well, but it's right on this. There you go. So those little teeny numbers right there. So you twist this dial and adjust your temperature. This one also uses a barrel plug at the back to power it. And when you're using that, make sure you follow the voltage recommendations. So 12 to 24 volts. Okay, this one's also 12 to 24 volts. Okay. The reason why that's important is if you're powering either of these from a lithium polymer battery, like a drone battery when you're soldering out in the field, and you plug in a battery that has too high a voltage, like say a 6S might be a little bit too high, 25 volts, you could damage the iron. So just be aware of that. Again, for this one, you might be using a wall power supply to power it, and that works fine. So that's another option there. This one does have removable tips. They're not the same style as most other removable tips, but they are removable. Okay. Zoom out a little bit more here. Okay, so this is similar to how the tips from this one look, but they are a little bit different interface and they have different contacts, I believe. So not all interchangeable, though you can replace the tips in this iron. A newbie drone does sell replacement tips last time I checked. So that's a good iron. Actually, I use this one pretty much all the time here in the lab until I accidentally left it on one day and burned out the tip, I believe. It doesn't seem to function well anymore, so I think I burned it out. Haven't yet bought a replacement. And that's a good reminder to never leave your soldering iron on and forget about it, because that's bad for a number of reasons. Okay, damage the tip, cause a fire. That was not a good move by me. Luckily, nothing else happened besides damaging the iron. Okay, so there's those two. This one is another one that I recently got to try out here. This one is called the Pine Sill, and actually is from a company called Pine 64. Some of you may have heard of them. It's a pretty advanced soldering iron for what it is, but it's really inexpensive, like 25, 35 bucks. I can't remember, but ridiculously cheap. And this does have removable tips. So let me show you some of those tips now. This one's off. Okay, so we got our kind of standard tip it came with, and then I bought this assortment of additional tips. Pull these out. Okay, we'll take a look at these. Let's see if we compare actually for a second. The newbie drone tip looks actually pretty similar with the way the contacts are laid out, but it's a lot longer. It doesn't have this little cap piece built in. It's got kind of a screw-on cap. I'm not sure if they'd be cross-compatible or not. I'm really not sure on that. Anyways, make sure you know the tip is compatible with your iron before you just plug it in and turn it on and damage something. Okay, so let me zoom in a little bit here. Let's see those tips better. Arrange those a little bit there. All right, so this tip at the left here is one I've already used. Got some solder on it still just to keep the iron from getting oxidized and stuff. So it looks kind of globby. It's a relatively normal kind of pencil style tip, kind of like this one. Maybe a little bit bigger than this one. I'm not sure if these are the same tip or not. I can't remember. Might have got a duplicate in the assortment. But anyways, we have a smaller tip here. Okay, we have an even finer tip here. You can see the difference between those two tips. This one's very fine. This is a little more coarse. Okay. Then we have what you might call a hoof tip. Okay, it looks kind of like an animal hoof. Okay. And I'm not sure what the name for this one would be. I should probably look that up. I'm sorry. But it is definitely a different style of tip. Each of these tips is going to give you a different contact area when you're soldering something. Okay, and that's why we have different tips. So if you're soldering something rather large, you might use a big hoof tip. There's also a chisel tip, which I don't have here to show you right now, but basically looks like a chisel. Okay, and you can then apply the heat to that one surface with a large surface area. That'll transfer more heat to whatever you're soldering on. Versus these ones here will transfer much smaller amounts of heat, much more precise. If you got to solder a very, very small thing next to something else that's very, very small, you don't want to use a big tip because you'll probably hit both of them at the same time and maybe ruin your other soldering you already finished. So you might need more precision for a smaller tip. So those are there, and these are all compatible with the Pine Sill. I'll put this back real quick. Let me power the pencil on real quick and I'll show you a little bit of what it looks like. I'm going to do it without a tip because I don't want it to heat up right now. But the pine sol, you can use either a barrel plug, like the other irons I showed you, or a USB-C, and that's why I bought this, was to try to test out some USB-C type maintenance kits, basically, with an iron and a charger and you know, that kind of thing, all powered by USB-C. Pretty cool. USB-C can go up to, I think, 20 volts, which is really nice for things like this. Okay, so there's our iron. It's saying no tip right now. That's fine. It's plugged into the wall, and it has some menus. Let's go here. So you can change menu items and things like that. Okay, and so it's quite advanced, you might say, for a soldering iron. It does have a lot of different settings and things. I'm sorry, it's not focusing very well on the screen. Um, but like I said, pretty cool iron. If you haven't got an iron yet, and you're looking for your own, I would recommend checking out the Pine Sol. This is the version 2, and I'm not an affiliate, I promise. I just think it's a good iron. It's got some cool features, things you can tweak with the firmware that's on board. Okay, so let me unplug that real quick. All right, so let's pull over something that some other stuff we're going to use to solder with, and I'll kind of go through the process a little bit, why we need all these different items, and then we can skip to the next video and actually do some soldering. So in your assignments, you may have seen some of these practice boards like this, or maybe a slightly smaller version. There's a couple of versions we use. But these ones are ones that students have done in the past. They didn't need any more after they finished the assignment, so I have them for demonstration purposes. And I'll also be doing some soldering on some of these with you in the next video. But for starters, these are our boards. These are to practice with, okay? We'll be doing some soldering on these boards, which you might realize if you look a little bit closer. Looks a lot like the demonstration board I showed you earlier, okay? With all the soldering on that flight controller. That's why we practice on these practice boards. They got the same size in terms of how big the solder pads are. These little squares or circles, basically spots where you solder, are called solder pads. They're pretty much the same size. We can do many of the same operations, like putting wires on them, putting connectors on, and things like that. Okay, and these are cheap. Practice boards are cheap. Messing up in your real flight controller that costs $100 is not cheap. Okay, so we practice on the practice boards, do kind of one-for-one practicing where we're trying to do things on here that are basically the same as what we'll do on the flight controller or whatever else you're soldering on, and that way you get a better option for practicing, not damaging expensive stuff. So there's our soldering boards. A lot of times when you're soldering, you'll need to hold things that are warm or hot, like a wire. So I also have a set of pliers here, or not pliers, sorry, tweezers. So I can hold the wire while I attach it to the board. And so I have some tweezers. You might have noticed these irons don't come with a stand like this red iron did. Now, when you're soldering, your iron is going to be really hot. So you need somewhere to put it down for a second while you move things around or get the wire or whatever you need. So if you don't have a stand built in, like the red iron does, you can get a little stand like this, just something to rest the iron on. That way it's not melting the table or the mat or whatever else or causing a fire. Okay, so that's a good option there, a little stand. Those come with a newbie drone kits if you have one of those, or you can just probably find one of these on Amazon for a few bucks. Just a little cheap. I mean, you could probably make one yourself or 3D print one if you wanted to, and have something to rest your iron on that's metal, right? You can't rest it on the plastic, of course, because it'll melt, but a little metal clip works great. Okay. Here is a spool of solder, right? This happens to be one that we use in the lab a lot. You can get different kinds. I would highly recommend that you get 6337, which is the tin and lead ratio in this solder. This is leaded solder, so when you're touching it and stuff, don't lick your fingers. Don't eat a bunch of food right after you go do soldering until you've washed your hands. But I would recommend 6337. That's one of the best ratios out there for leaded solder, and leaded solder is much easier to solder with than lead-free solder, so I'd recommend using it in your soldering activities. We have a 2% here, and that's for the rosin core, which is basically a cleaning agent that's actually inside the solder. I don't think this is going to focus well enough on the end of the solder, but if you were able to see it well enough, then you would be able to see in the center of the metal there is a spot that looks darker, and that's the rosin or the flux that's inside of the solder, and that helps keep the solder joints clean while you're soldering. 100 grams is just how much solder is on this spool, okay, and 0.8 millimeters is how what the diameter of the solder is. So this, in this case, it's a little bit shy of 1 millimeter thick, and that works great for most of the stuff we do in our class with our small UAS. Okay? You can get different thicknesses, of course, if you're soldering something really big, but generally speaking, we keep it around this size. Works pretty well. So there's our solder. I'll zoom out a little bit more here. This is what's called a brass sponge, and if you don't have a regular sponge like this one here to wipe your iron off periodically while you're soldering to clean it off, then you can use a brass sponge. I prefer the brass sponge because you don't have to get it wet, whereas this you have to get it wet to not burn it when you're wiping the hot soldering iron off on it. The brass sponge you don't have to get wet, so I just usually use it and keep it close by so I can clean my iron off when I'm soldering. So we have that there, a little stand. Okay, a couple other things I have here are these. This is what's called a flux pen. This comes in the newbie drone kit again, but it's basically that same cleaning agent that's inside of the solder. There's a little bit inside the solder. This is extra, and it's in like a marker format, so you can take it and color or coat some pads before you then go over and solder them. Okay, and what that does is the flux helps keep the solder joint clean, which helps keep the surface tension of the solder good, and that way when you're soldering, the solder wants to go where it's supposed to go. Okay, it doesn't get stuck to your iron too much and create big peaks or problems with your solder. It sticks better to the pads and whatever else you're going to solder as well. It also works on wires. Okay, for the wires though, what I'll typically do is I'll use some flux paste. This stuff looks kind of like really old peanut butter or something. It smells, I don't know. It smells like flux, I guess. It's not really an unpleasant smell, but it's not a normal smell you'd smell every day. But this is basically that same stuff again that's inside the solder, just in a paste form. Okay. What I'll do when I'm doing wires, you guys will see me do this. After I tin a wire, I'll kind of dip it in here before I attach it to the pad I'm going to solder it to, and that helps keep it nice and clean. Helps the solder go way smoother. I'd really recommend using flux in some kind of capacity in addition to this flux already in here when you're soldering. It just makes it so much easier, so much easier. Okay. And so that's a little bit of extra flux. You can always use like a toothpick or something and put a little bit on a pad. If you needed to redo the pad and you needed to clean it off, not get the pad dirty while you're soldering, you could use a little bit extra flux that way too. So there's some flux. I think that's all the tools I have. I have a couple of wire strippers. We'll use those a little bit later. Just some wire stripper and cutters that are pretty standard. So, all right. Hopefully that helps explain a little bit of our soldering tools we're going to be using today and gives you a little background on what we're doing. So I'm going to break the video here. We'll go to the next video. We'll start doing some of the assignment. Thanks.